Hello and welcome to History at Night. For over 2,000 years, scholars have puzzled over a story so extraordinary that it seems to belong more to dreams than to history. In ancient Athens, around the year 350 before the Common Era, an old philosopher named Plato sat down to write about the perfect society. What emerged from his pen was not merely a theoretical exercise, but a tale of a civilization so magnificent, so advanced, so utterly perfect, that it could only have been blessed by the gods themselves. He called this place Atlantis, and he claimed it had existed 9,000 years before his own time. According to Plato, it was an island empire greater in size than Libya and Asia, combined a naval power so mighty that it had once threatened to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. And then in the space of a single day and night, it had vanished beneath the waves, leaving behind only legends and an impassable barrier of mud. The story was so detailed, so precise in its measurements and descriptions that many who heard it believed it must be true. Others dismissed it as nothing more than an elegant philosophical allegory. The debate has raged ever since, and yet there is something about Atlantis that refuses to fade away, something that calls to us across the centuries like a voice from the depths of the ocean itself. How could the tale of a lost civilization recorded by a single ancient author capture the imagination of humanity for over 2,300 years? What is it about Plato's Atlantis that continues to inspire explorers, scholars, dreamers, and mystics to search the corners of the earth for proof that it once existed? This is one of history's most enduring mysteries, a riddle wrapped in philosophy, poetry, and the deepest human longings for a golden age that might once have been. Tonight we will journey beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the vast Atlantic Ocean, where Plato claimed this impossible civilization once flourished. We will walk through temples of ivory and gold, sail past harbours carved from living rock, and witness the rise and fall of the most perfect society the ancient world ever imagined. We will explore the mind of the philosopher who gave birth to this legend, examine the Egyptian sources he claimed inspired him, and ask whether the story of Atlantis might contain echoes of real civilizations that rose and fell in the mists of prehistory. And we will discover why this tale of a lost paradise continues to serve as a mirror for our own hopes, fears, and dreams about what human civilization might become. But before we begin our journey into the depths of this ancient mystery, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It is a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So I would really love to hear from you in the comments. Are you perhaps one of those who believes that Atlantis really existed somewhere beneath the waves? Or do you see it as Plato intended it as a mirror, held up to show us the possibilities and dangers of human civilization? And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back through the centuries to ancient Athens, where an old man with penetrating eyes and a mind like the sharpest blade ever forged began to tell a story that would outlive empires. To understand the mystery of Atlantis, we must first understand the mystery of the man who created it. We must enter the academy of Plato, walk among his students, and listen as he weaves together Egyptian wisdom, philosophical insight, and perhaps something more, something that came to him from sources we can no longer trace. For the story of Atlantis is also the story of how a single tale, told by a single voice, can echo across millennia and become more real to the human heart than many things that actually happened. The perfect mirror is about to be revealed, and in its reflection, we might see not only the truth about a lost civilization, but something far more profound about ourselves. The story begins not in the golden age of Athens, but in the shadow-haunted halls of an Egyptian temple, where priests with memories longer than empires whispered of a war that had shaken the very foundations of the ancient world. According to Plato, It was his ancestor Solon who first heard this tale during his travels to Egypt around the year 600 before the Common Era. The old lawgiver had come to the sacred city of Sais seeking wisdom from priests whose records stretched back through dynasties that made Athens seem like a city born yesterday. There, in chambers filled with the scent of papyrus and incense, the priests spoke of events so ancient that they existed in that twilight realm between history and myth. 9,000 years before Solon's time, they claimed a great war had erupted between two mighty powers, and yet only one side remembered it. On the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, the ancestors of the Greeks had built a civilization that the Egyptian priests described with something approaching wonder. These proto-Athenians, as Plato would later call them, had created a society of incredible justice and military prowess. They were the champions of all who lived within the Pillars of Hercules, the protectors of the civilized world. But their enemy came from beyond the edge of all maps, from an island empire that controlled the Western Ocean as completely as any god might rule his domain. The war, according to these ancient records, had been titanic in scope. Picture fleets so vast that they darkened the horizon, armies so numerous that their marching shook the earth itself. The fate of every Mediterranean city, every coastal settlement, every island kingdom hung in the balance. It was Athens against Atlantis, the known world, against the unknown, east against west, in a conflict that would determine the very future of human civilization. But there was something profoundly unsettling about this tale, something that made the Egyptian priests speak in hushed tones. While the Atlanteans possessed wealth beyond imagination and weapons that gleamed like captured starlight, while their ships were swifter than dolphins and their warriors more numerous than the sands of Libya, it was the small city-state of Athens that emerged victorious. How was this possible? How could a single Greek city, however noble, defeat an empire that spanned continents? The priests offered no clear answer, speaking only of Athenian virtue and divine favour of courage that burned brighter than Atlantean gold. And then came the most mysterious part of all. Shortly after their victory, both civilizations vanished from the records of history. Atlantis sank beneath the waves in a single cataclysmic day, becoming nothing more than an impassable barrier of mud in the Western Sea. But Athens, too, seemed to forget its own triumph completely. When the ancestors of classical Greeks finally emerged from what scholars now call the Greek Dark Ages, they carried no memory of this ancient glory, no songs of victory over the masters of the Atlantic. The silence was absolute. It was as if the gods themselves had decided that such knowledge was too dangerous for mortals to remember. As if the very story of this conflict contained truths too profound, too terrible, or too wonderful for ordinary human consciousness to bear. Only in the sacred archives of Egypt, protected by priests who served as the memory keepers of the ancient world, did fragments of this cosmic drama survive. But why would the Egyptians remember what the Greeks themselves had forgotten? What made this distant war so significant that it deserved preservation in the most sacred chronicles of the Nile? And what did it mean that Plato, writing his philosophical dialogues 2.5 millennia later, would choose this particular tale as the vehicle for his deepest thoughts about justice, power, and the rise and fall of civilizations? The perfect mirror was beginning to form, reflecting not just one lost civilization, but two. To understand the true magnitude of what Plato claimed existed beyond the Western horizon, we must first imagine ourselves standing at the very edge of the ancient world. Picture the massive stone pillars that marked the boundary between the Mediterranean Sea and the vast unknown Atlantic Ocean, those towering monuments that the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules, and that we know today as the Strait of Gibraltar. Here, where Europe and Africa nearly touched, where the familiar blue waters of the inland sea gave way to the grey-green swells of an ocean that seemed to stretch into infinity, ancient mariners would pause before their final prayers to the gods. Beyond this threshold lay mystery itself. For the Greeks, the Mediterranean was everything. It was their highway, their marketplace, their battlefield, and their home. Every island, every bay, every hidden cove had been mapped by generations of traders and warriors whose bronze-prowed ships had turned the inland sea into a vast network of commerce and culture. But the Atlantic remained largely forbidden, a realm where sea monsters dwelt and where the very ocean floor dropped away into depths that no anchor could sound. To sail west from the Pillars of Hercules was to leave behind not just the known world, but the protection of familiar gods and the comfort of charted waters. And yet, according to Plato, it was precisely here, in this realm of endless waters and unknown dangers, that the greatest civilization the world had ever seen had once flourished. Atlantis, he claimed, was an island empire larger than Libya and Asia combined. To appreciate the staggering scope of this assertion, we must remember that to the ancient Greeks, Libya represented the entire northern coast of Africa, a land that stretched from the Nile Delta to the furthest reaches of the Western Desert. Asia, in their understanding, encompassed what we now call Asia Minor, the vast peninsula that includes modern-day Turkey, a region that had given birth to Troy, to the kingdoms of Lydia and Phrygia, to cities of legendary wealth and power. Imagine then an island nation that dwarfed both of these immense territories. Imagine a landmass so vast that it could contain multiple kingdoms, countless cities, forests that took days to cross, and mountain ranges that rose like walls against the sky. This was not some small island paradise tucked away in a forgotten corner of the ocean. This was a continental empire, a new world that existed thousands of years before any European dreamed of sailing west in search of unknown lands. But size alone was not what made Atlantis extraordinary. According to Plato's account, this massive island served as the centre of a maritime empire that controlled the entire western Atlantic. Atlantean fleets, he claimed, had established colonies and trading posts on countless smaller islands scattered throughout the ocean. Their ships carried the finest goods from distant shores. Their merchants spoke dozens of languages, and their admirals commanded sea routes that connected civilizations separated by thousands of miles of open water. They had achieved what would not be accomplished again until the age of European exploration, creating a truly global network of trade and communication that spanned oceanic distances. The implications were breathtaking. While the ancestors of the Greeks were still learning to work bronze, while the Egyptians were just beginning to build their first pyramids, while most of humanity lived in small villages scattered across a world that seemed impossibly vast and disconnected, the Atlanteans had supposedly mastered the art of ocean navigation. They had mapped currents that European sailors would not discover for another 8,000 years. They had learned to read the stars from perspectives that no Mediterranean mariner could imagine. They had become in effect the first true citizens of the world, their homeland serving as the beating heart of a civilization that pulsed across the globe. And this empire was so powerful, so advanced, that it had grown restless within its oceanic domain. Like all great civilizations at their peak, Atlantis had begun to look beyond its borders with hungry eyes. The known world, with its small city-states and modest kingdoms, its limited resources and primitive technologies, must have seemed ripe for conquest. What could possibly stand against fleets that had mastered the open ocean? What army could face warriors who had conquered continents? The Atlanteans gathered their strength for what they believed would be their greatest triumph. Their invasion force, according to the Egyptian records, was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Ships beyond counting carried warriors, equipped with weapons forged from metals unknown to Mediterranean craftsmen. Their very presence in eastern waters was enough to strike terror into every coastal settlement, from Spain to the Aegean. The ancient world held its breath, but there was something the masters of the Atlantic had not anticipated, something that their vast fleets and countless warriors could not overcome. For all their power, for all their technological superiority, for all their mastery of wind and wave, they were about to encounter a force that no amount of orichalcum or ocean-born wisdom could defeat. The perfect mirror was about to crack. But to understand how such an empire could rise to challenge the very gods themselves, we must travel back to the beginning, to a time when Atlantis was nothing more than a simple island, home to a people so primitive that they had never seen a ship, never imagined that lands existed beyond their horizon, never dreamed that the endless waters surrounding them connected to anything larger than their own small world. In the centre of this forgotten island, there rose a hill, not particularly remarkable for its height or beauty. It was the kind of gentle elevation that countless islands possess, crowned with olive groves and wildflowers, surrounded by fertile plains that provided everything a simple people might need. Upon this hill lived the descendants of one of the earth-born men of that distant age, a lineage that had dwelt there since the world was young. The last of this ancient family was a man named Evenor, and he had taken as his wife a woman called Leucippe. Together they lived in the peaceful obscurity that was the common lot of humanity in those days when the distance between mortal and divine seemed as vast as the ocean itself. They had been blessed with a single daughter, and her name was Cleito. By all accounts, she was extraordinarily beautiful, though not in the way that we might imagine when we think of legendary queens or mythical heroines. Hers was the beauty of simplicity itself, the kind of natural grace that needs no ornament to shine. She moved through her father's orchards like a spirit of the earth, tending to flowers that seemed to bloom more brightly in her presence, gathering fruit that tasted sweeter from her hands. When she walked along the shore collecting shells and sea-worn stones, the waves themselves seemed to whisper her name, and it was there along that peaceful coastline that she caught the attention of a god. Poseidon, the great earth-shaker, ruler of all the oceans, master of horses and storms, and the very foundations of the world, had been travelling through his vast domain when his eyes fell upon this simple island maiden. Perhaps it was her innocence that captivated him, the way she moved through her small world with such contentment, never knowing that she lived upon an island no larger than a single bay in his mighty realm. Perhaps it was her kindness to the sea creatures that washed up on her shores, the gentle way she would return stranded fish to the waves, or shelter tired birds beneath the eaves of her family's modest home. Whatever the reason, the god of the seas found himself drawn to her as the tide is drawn by the moon. But love between divine and mortal has always been a dangerous thing. Where gods love, the very fabric of the world bends and reshapes itself. Mountains rise at their passion, rivers change their courses at their whims, and islands themselves can be transformed by the intensity of their desires. When Poseidon fell in love with Cleito, it was not merely the heart of a god that was moved, but the fundamental forces that shape land and sea. Soon after Cleito reached womanhood, both her parents died, leaving her alone on the hilltop where she had been born. There was something profoundly touching about her solitude, the way she continued to tend their small gardens and maintain their simple shrine, faithful to the memory of those who had raised her, even as she faced an uncertain future. It was during this time of mourning and solitude that Poseidon came to her, not as the terrible earth-shaker, whose wrath could split continents, but as a presence gentle as rainfall, warm as sunlight on water. Their love was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. To create a dwelling place worthy of his beloved Poseidon performed a feat of engineering that would have impressed even the gods themselves. With his mighty hands he began to reshape the very landscape of Cleito's island, carving perfect circles of land and water around the hill where she lived. He created alternating rings of sea and earth, each one larger than the last, each one perfectly centered on the place where love had first taken root. There were 3 rings of water and 2 of land, each fashioned with the precision of a master craftsman turning clay upon a wheel. The rings were so perfectly circular, so mathematically precise, that they seemed to have been drawn by a divine compass. No mortal hand could have achieved such geometric perfection. No human mind could have conceived such elegant symmetry. The result was breathtaking. From the air, the island now resembled a vast target or mandala, a sacred pattern that spoke of divine order and cosmic harmony. Each ring of water was exactly the right width to serve as a harbour, each band of land exactly the right size for cultivation and building. The whole design pulsed outward from the central hill like ripples from a stone dropped into perfectly still water, creating not just a new geography, but a new kind of space, entirely a place where divine love had literally reshaped the world. And this was only the beginning. For the god of the seas, love was not merely an emotion, but an act of creation itself. And what Poseidon created for Plato became the architectural wonder that would serve as the beating heart of the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever imagined. The rings he had carved were not simple earthworks, but masterpieces of divine engineering that defied every law of physics and probability. The outermost ring of water was exactly 3 stadia in breadth, wide enough for the largest ships to sail, in perfect formation, deep enough to accommodate vessels that had travelled from the farthest corners of the ocean. The ring of land that lay within it matched this measurement, precisely creating a perfect balance between sea and earth that seemed to pulse with mathematical harmony. Each successive ring diminished in size according to some cosmic proportion that only a god could calculate. The second ring of water measured 2 stadia across, while its corresponding band of land maintained the same elegant dimensions. Finally, at the very centre, lay the smallest ring of water, just 1 stadium in width, embracing the original hill, where Plato had been born, like a liquid necklace around the throat of the earth. And this was where true magnificence began. The central island itself, the sacred heart of what would become Atlantis, measured exactly 5 stadia in diameter. Here Poseidon raised a palace that seemed to have been dreamed into existence, rather than built by any earthly craft. The very stones from which it was constructed told a story of divine artistry, for the god had taught his beloved's descendants to quarry 3 kinds of stone from the living rock beneath their island. One was white as the foam that crowns ocean waves, another black as the deepest trenches, where no light has ever penetrated, and the third red as the coral that grows in secret gardens beneath the sea. These stones they arranged in patterns that caught and reflected light in ways that mortal architecture had never achieved. White stone alternated with black in checkerboard patterns that seemed to shift and dance when viewed from different angles. Red stone formed borders and accents that glowed like captured fire when the sun struck them at dawn and dusk. The effect was hypnotic, as if the palace walls themselves were alive with gentle flame. But even more remarkable than the stones was the metal that the Atlanteans discovered deep within their island's core. They called it orichalcum, and Plato claimed that in those days it was more precious than anything except gold itself. This mysterious substance gleamed with its own inner light, neither quite copper nor bronze nor any metal known to Mediterranean craftsmen. When worked by skilled hands, it could be shaped into sheets so thin they seemed translucent, yet strong enough to serve as armour for the greatest warriors. When polished, it reflected light with a warm, reddish glow that made everything it touched seem touched by divine fire. The temples and public buildings of the central island were sheathed in this miraculous metal. The outermost walls were covered with brass that gleamed like captured sunlight. The middle ring received a coating of tin that shone like liquid silver in the moonlight. But the innermost citadel, the sacred heart of the whole complex, blazed with the red fire of orichalcum, creating a beacon that could be seen from distances that seemed impossible. And connecting all of these rings was perhaps the most ingenious engineering feat of all. Poseidon had not merely created separate circles of land and water, he had bridged them with passages so elegant, so perfectly proportioned, that they seemed to be part of the natural landscape itself. Great stone causeways spanned the rings of water at precisely calculated intervals, wide enough for ceremonial processions yet narrow enough to be easily defended. Where these bridges crossed the waterways, the god had carved channels beneath them, passages exactly wide enough to allow a single trireme to pass from one ring to another. The result was a city that could function both as an impregnable fortress and as a bustling commercial port. Ships arriving from distant lands could navigate through the rings like visitors following a sacred labyrinth, passing through gate after gate, bridge after bridge, until they reached the innermost harbour, where the greatest treasures and most important ceremonies awaited them. From above, the whole complex resembled nothing so much as a vast mandala carved into the living earth, a sacred pattern that spoke of cosmic order and divine proportion. Every measurement was perfect. Every angle was precisely calculated. Every stone was placed with the kind of attention to detail that only immortal love could inspire. The perfect mirror was taking shape, and in its reflection, humanity would glimpse both its highest possibilities and its deepest flaws. Yet all of this architectural splendor was merely the stage upon which an even greater drama would unfold. For Poseidon and Plato had not created this paradise simply to admire its beauty. They had built it to be the cradle of a new kind of civilization, one that would be ruled by their own children, born of the union between divine power and mortal grace. Their love would give birth to kings. From the divine architecture of the central citadel, our eyes must now turn to the island itself, for what Poseidon had created was not merely a magnificent city, but an entire world that seemed to have been blessed by every god who had ever taken interest in mortal affairs. Atlantis was an island that defied all natural law, where other lands might specialize in one particular gift, offering perhaps fertile soil for agriculture, or rich veins of precious metal, or abundant forests for timber. Atlantis possessed everything in such lavish abundance that its inhabitants could scarcely believe their fortune. It was as if the god who shaped their homeland had decided to concentrate within its borders every blessing that nature had scattered across the rest of the earth. The result was a paradise so complete, so perfectly provisioned, that its people would never need to look beyond their shores for anything that could sustain or enrich human life. The forests alone would have made any kingdom wealthy beyond measure. Ancient groves stretched across the island's interior, filled with trees of every variety known to the Mediterranean world, and many that grew nowhere else on earth. There were towering oaks, whose trunks were so massive that 20 men linking hands could barely encircle them, their branches providing timber strong enough to build ships that could weather the fiercest storms. Elegant cypress trees rose like spears toward the sky, their wood prized for its resistance to rot and its sweet-lasting fragrance. Pine forests carpeted entire mountainsides, their resin providing the materials for waterproofing and medicine, their nuts offering sustenance for both human and animal populations. And moving through these vast woodlands were creatures that would have seemed mythical to inhabitants of smaller, poorer lands. Great herds of elephants wandered the forests and plains of Atlantis, their trumpeting calls echoing across valleys that had never known the sound of human warfare. These magnificent beasts, larger and more numerous than any that roamed the known world, served not as exotic curiosities, but as an integral part of island life. The Atlanteans had learned to work with them as partners, using their strength to move massive stones for construction projects, their intelligence to aid in complex engineering tasks, their gentle nature to teach children about the harmony that was possible between human and animal life. But it was not merely the large and dramatic creatures that made Atlantis extraordinary. The island teemed with life in every form imaginable. Crystal clear lakes reflected the flight of birds whose songs were so beautiful that visitors would stop their work simply to listen. Rivers ran swift and clean through valleys where fish leapt silver in the sunlight, their numbers so abundant that catching them required no more skill than extending one's hand into the water. The very air seemed alive with fragrance and music. From every corner of the island rose the scents of flowers and herbs that grew in wild profusion across landscapes that seemed more like carefully tended gardens than natural wilderness. Roses bloomed in hedgerows that stretched for miles. Their petals used to create perfumes and medicines that were traded across the known world. Lavender carpeted entire hillsides in purple waves that moved like gentle seas beneath the island breezes. Fruit trees of every description dotted the countryside, their branches bending low under the weight of harvests that came not once but twice each year. The soil itself seemed magical in its fertility. Where Mediterranean farmers might struggle to coax a single crop from rocky ground, Atlantean fields yielded grain so abundantly that storage became a greater challenge than cultivation. Wheat grew golden and heavy, its kernels larger and more nutritious than any variety known to foreign lands. Barley flourished even in areas that received little rainfall, its hardy stalks providing both food for humans and fodder for the countless animals that grazed across the island's pastures. And beneath this surface abundance lay treasures that made foreign kings weep with envy. The mountains of Atlantis were honeycombed with veins of precious metals that ran through the rock like rivers of solidified starlight. Gold could be found in such quantity that it was used not merely for jewelry and ceremonial objects, but for everyday items that would have been crafted from bronze or iron in poorer lands. Silver flowed from mountain streams, where it had been washed down by centuries of gentle erosion, accumulating in pools, where children could gather it like pebbles from a beach. But most precious of all was the mysterious orichalcum that gleamed in the deepest chambers of the earth. This metal, which combined the strength of copper with the beauty of gold, and possessed a warm, reddish glow that seemed to pulse with inner life, was found nowhere else in all the world. Atlantean craftsmen had learned to work it with such skill that they could create sheets thin enough to serve as clothing, yet strong enough to turn aside the sharpest blades. The abundance was almost overwhelming in its completeness. Every fruit that Mediterranean peoples prized grew larger and sweeter on Atlantean soil. Every grain produced yields that seemed impossible. Every tree grew straighter and stronger. Every flower bloomed more brilliantly. Every stream ran clearer and more abundantly. It was as if the normal laws that governed scarcity and limitation had been suspended within the borders of this blessed island, replaced by principles that operated according to divine rather than earthly mathematics. The perfect mirror reflected infinite possibilities. With such abundance at their disposal, the descendants of Poseidon and Plato became the greatest builders and engineers the world had ever known, transforming their divinely blessed island into a showcase of human achievement that would not be surpassed for thousands of years. The Atlanteans approached construction not as mere necessity, but as a form of worship, each project an offering to the god who had given them both the materials and the inspiration to reshape their world. They built not simply to shelter themselves from the elements, but to create spaces worthy of the divine blood that flowed in their veins, structures that would serve as bridges between the mortal and immortal realms. The result was architecture that seemed to breathe with life itself, engineering that defied the very laws of physics, and a harmony between human ambition and natural beauty that had never been achieved before or since. Their temples rose like mountains crafted from starlight and dreams. The greatest of these was the temple of Poseidon himself, which stood at the very heart of the central island, like the axis around which the entire world turned. A full stadium in length and half a stadium in width, its dimensions were calculated according to proportions that only divine mathematics could produce. The exterior walls were sheathed entirely in silver, that caught and reflected sunlight with such brilliance that sailors approaching from the outer rings could see its glow long before the building itself became visible. But it was the interior that truly took the breath away. Every surface was covered in ivory that had been carved with such delicate precision that the very walls seemed to flow like frozen music. Gold traced intricate patterns across the ivory foundation, creating designs so complex and beautiful that visitors would stand transfixed for hours discovering new details with every shift of light. Silver accents provided highlights that seemed to move and dance as the sun tracked across the sky. And throughout it all, the warm red glow of orichalcum created an atmosphere that was both earthly and divine, both intimate and cosmic in its scope. At the temple's heart stood a statue of the sea god himself that defied all human understanding of sculptural art. Carved from a single block of ivory, so massive that its origins remain a mystery, the figure of Poseidon stood tall enough to touch the temple's vaulted ceiling. His golden chariot was drawn by 6 winged horses, whose manes seemed to flow in an eternal breeze, their hooves positioned as if they were about to leap into flight. Around the statue's base, smaller figures of sea nymphs danced in eternal celebration, their faces so lifelike that those who gazed upon them claimed they could see the figures breathing. But the Atlanteans' mastery extended far beyond individual buildings, no matter how magnificent. They had learned to think on a scale that encompassed entire landscapes, reshaping the geography of their island with the same attention to detail that other civilizations might devote to a single palace chamber. The great canal that connected their central city to the sea represented an engineering achievement that would not be matched until the modern age. 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep, this artificial waterway stretched for 50 stadia through terrain that included hills, valleys, and rocky outcroppings that would have defeated lesser engineers. The Atlanteans carved through solid stone as if it were clay-bridged chasms that seemed impossible to span, and maintained a gradient so precise that water flowed smoothly from the inland city to the ocean harbour without the need for locks or mechanical assistance. How did they accomplish such feats? How could a Bronze Age civilization move stones that weighed thousands of tons, carve channels through solid rock, and create architectural marvels that seemed to defy gravity itself? The answer lay not merely in their abundant resources, but in their understanding of principles that would not be rediscovered by human science for millennia to come. They had learned to work with natural forces rather than against them, to channel the power of wind and water and earth in ways that amplified human effort 1,000-fold. Their tools were not merely bronze and iron, but leverage and mathematics, hydraulics and engineering principles that transformed impossible dreams into solid reality. Their harbours were carved from living rock with such skill that they seemed to have been shaped by the tides themselves, rather than human hands. Great galleries stretched deep into the island's foundations, their roofs supported by pillars that had been left standing as the surrounding stone was carefully removed. Ships could shelter within these stone chambers during the fiercest storms, protected by walls that would endure for eternity. The perfect mirror was reaching its full brilliance, reflecting a vision of human potential that seemed almost too magnificent to believe. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Atlantean civilization was not their architectural marvels or their mastery over the elements, but the sacred ceremonies that bound their empire together across vast distances and countless generations. Rituals so ancient and profound that they seemed to echo from the very foundations of time itself. Every 5th and 6th year, alternately, the 10 kings who ruled the territories of Atlantis would gather at the Temple of Poseidon to renew the sacred oaths that had governed their civilization since the age of the god himself. This was no mere political assembly, no gathering of ambitious rulers seeking to advance their own interests. It was a religious ceremony of such profound significance that its observance took precedence over wars, harvests, trade negotiations, and every other concern of earthly rule. The pilgrimage to the central island began months before the appointed time, as each king made his way across the waters that separated the various territories of their maritime empire. They came not in warships bristling with bronze spears and armed warriors, but in vessels of ceremony and peace, their hulls painted in the sacred colours of their dynasties, their sails emblazoned with symbols that told the story of their divine ancestry. The very sight of these royal fleets converging on the central rings of Atlantis was said to be one of the most beautiful spectacles the ancient world had ever witnessed. As each king's vessel entered the outermost harbour, the entire city would fall into reverential silence. The ceremonies themselves followed patterns that had been established by Poseidon himself in the earliest days of Atlantean history, recorded not on fragile papyrus or clay tablets that might crumble with age, but upon a pillar of orichalcum that stood at the very heart of the great temple. This sacred column, forged from the mysterious metal that gleamed with its own inner fire, bore inscriptions that detailed not only the laws that governed relationships between the 10 kingdoms, but also the specific rituals through which those laws must be honoured and renewed. The most sacred of these rituals began at dawn on the day of assembly, when the 10 kings entered the temple of Poseidon alone, leaving behind their guards, their advisors, their royal regalia, and even their weapons. They approached the god not as rulers of vast territories, but as humble descendants, seeking divine blessing for another period of righteous governance. Within the temple grounds, sacred bulls roamed freely, magnificent creatures that had never known the touch of rope or chain, animals so pure and perfect that they seemed to have stepped directly from the realm of the gods themselves. These were not ordinary cattle, but beasts whose lineages could be traced back to the very herds that Poseidon himself had blessed in the beginning times. Their hides gleamed like polished bronze in the temple's golden light. Their eyes held an intelligence that was both animal and something more than animal. Their movements possessed a grace that seemed almost supernatural. And it was these sacred animals that the kings must capture for their ceremony, using nothing but their own hands and simple tools that recalled the primitive origins of their divine authority. The hunt was unlike any chase that had ever taken place elsewhere in the ancient world. No bronze-tipped spears flashed in the morning sunlight. No arrows sang through the temple air. No nets entangled the sacred creatures in webs of rope and cunning. Instead, the 10 most powerful rulers on earth stalked their prey with wooden staves and braided cords, relying not on the instruments of war, but on patience, cooperation, and the kind of skill that connected them directly to their most ancient ancestors. The chase could last for hours sometimes, stretching deep into the afternoon, as the bulls led their royal hunters through the temple's sacred groves and across its marble courtyards. There was something profoundly humbling about watching these kings who commanded fleets that could darken entire horizons, reduced to tracking their quarry like primitive hunters from the dawn of time. When at last one of the sacred bulls was captured, the solemnity that descended upon the temple was absolute. The chosen animal was led with infinite reverence to the great pillar of orichalcum, where the ancient laws gleamed in letters of divine metal. Here, in the most sacred act of their civilization, the kings would perform the ritual that bound them not only to each other, but to the cosmic order that their god ancestor had established. The bull's throat was opened above the pillar's apex, allowing its lifeblood to flow down across the sacred inscriptions, renewing the words with crimson that seemed to glow like liquid fire against the warm red metal. The blood carried more than symbolic meaning. It was the bridge between mortal and divine, between the laws written in metal and the living reality of just governance. As it flowed across Poseidon's ancient commands, the words themselves seemed to come alive, pulsing with renewed power and authority. But there was something else flowing with that sacred blood, something that would eventually transform blessing into cursed divine order, into mortal corruption. The perfect mirror was beginning to show its first hairline cracks. For countless generations after the sacred rituals were established, the blood of Poseidon flowed strong and pure through the veins of those who ruled the greatest empire the world had ever known. And in those golden centuries, Atlantis became something more than a mere civilization. It became a living testament to what humanity could achieve when divine wisdom guided mortal hands, when immortal virtue shaped earthly governance, when the highest aspirations of both gods and men found perfect expression in a single shining realm. The early kings of Atlantis ruled not as tyrants drunk on power, but as shepherds whose deepest joy lay in the welfare of their flocks. They possessed a kind of wisdom that seemed to flow directly from the mind of their divine ancestor, an understanding of justice so perfect and intuitive that they rarely needed to consult written laws or debate the merits of difficult decisions. When disputes arose between citizens, when questions of inheritance or trade or territorial boundaries required resolution, these God-born rulers would listen with the patience of the eternal sea itself, weighing every word, considering every nuance until solutions emerged that satisfied not merely the letter of the law, but its deepest spirit. Their courts were unlike any tribunal that had existed before or since. There was no pomp or ceremony designed to intimidate those who sought justice. No golden thrones elevated the rulers above their subjects, like distant, unapproachable gods. Instead, the Atlantean kings would sit in simple chairs carved from the sacred woods of their island, surrounded by gardens where the scent of flowers mingled with the sound of fountains, creating an atmosphere of peace that encouraged honesty rather than fear. Citizens approached their rulers not as supplicants trembling before awesome power, but as children seeking guidance from wise and loving parents. And the guidance they received was extraordinary in its gentleness and its effectiveness. The Atlantean kings possessed an almost supernatural ability to see beyond the surface of human conflicts to the deeper currents of emotion and need that drove them. A dispute between neighbours over property boundaries might be resolved not through rigid application of surveying techniques, but through patient exploration of the underlying concerns that had caused the disagreement. Perhaps one family feared that their children would have no land to inherit. Perhaps another worried that their elderly parents would lose access to a cherished garden. A king with divine insight could address these deeper anxieties while simultaneously settling the immediate legal question, creating solutions that left all parties not merely satisfied, but genuinely grateful. This was governance elevated to the level of art, of poetry, of something approaching divine creation itself. The wisdom of these early rulers extended far beyond the resolution of individual conflicts. They understood that true prosperity could not be measured merely in terms of wealth accumulated or territory conquered, but required the cultivation of human virtues that would ensure the lasting happiness of their people. They established schools where children learned not only the practical skills necessary for craftsmanship and trade, but also the deeper arts of music, poetry, and philosophical contemplation that nourished the soul. They built theatres where the greatest dramas of their age explored questions of justice, courage, and the proper relationship between mortal ambition and divine will. They supported scholars whose research into mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy advanced human understanding in ways that would benefit not only their own citizens, but all future generations. They encouraged artists whose sculptures and paintings captured beauty so perfectly that viewers would stand transfixed, feeling themselves transported to realms where ugliness and discord could not exist. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the way these God-born kings dealt with the temptations of power itself. Other rulers in other lands might surround themselves with luxuries that demonstrated their superiority over their subjects. They might build palaces whose magnificence served mainly to humble visitors and remind them of their own insignificance. They might accumulate treasures simply for the pleasure of possession, gathering gold and jewels, and works of art like a dragon hoarding wealth in its cave. The Atlantean kings viewed such accumulation with something approaching pity. They understood that true wealth lay not in the possession of beautiful objects, but in the ability to create and share beauty with others. Their palaces, though magnificent beyond imagination, served not as private retreats but as centres of cultural life, where citizens could gather to enjoy music, poetry, and philosophical discourse. Their treasures were displayed not as symbols of royal power, but as offerings to the gods, an inspiration for future artists. They possessed everything and desired nothing beyond the welfare of their people, and their people responded with a devotion that was both freely given and absolute in its depth. Citizens of Atlantis did not obey their rulers from fear of punishment, but from genuine love and respect for leaders who had proven themselves worthy of trust. Rebellion was not merely unnecessary, but literally unthinkable, for why would anyone rebel against rulers who sought only to serve? The perfect mirror reflected an image of human potential that seemed almost too beautiful to be real, and yet for generation after generation, it was real. The divine blood held strong, the wisdom endured. The gentleness never hardened into weakness, the strength never corrupted into tyranny. But even divine blood, when mixed too often with mortal clay, can lose its potency. But even the most perfect of divine gifts, when passed from generation to generation through mortal vessels, must eventually face the inexorable mathematics of dilution, and what had begun as pure godhood flowing through human veins would slowly, almost imperceptibly, become something else entirely. The change did not come suddenly, like a thunderbolt splitting the sky or an earthquake shaking the foundations of the world. It crept forward with the stealth of morning mist, so gradual that those who lived through it barely noticed its approach. Each generation of Atlantean rulers seemed to their own eyes as noble and wise as those who had come before. Each king believed himself to be governing with the same divine insight that had blessed his ancestors since the time of Poseidon himself. And yet something was shifting in the very fabric of their civilization. The first signs were so subtle that only the most perceptive observers might have noticed them, and even then they could easily have been dismissed as the natural variations that occur in any living society. Perhaps a king took slightly longer to resolve a dispute than his father might have. Perhaps a royal decision, while still fundamentally just, showed a bit more concern for practical advantage than for pure principle. Perhaps the sacred ceremonies, while still performed with reverence, began to feel more like obligations than expressions of spontaneous worship. These were not dramatic failures of character or wisdom. They were tiny shifts in emphasis, minute alterations in the balance between divine and human nature that existed within every descendant of the sea god. But like drops of water wearing away stone, these small changes accumulated over time, creating alterations that would eventually reshape the entire landscape of Atlantean society. The divine blood was growing thin. With each passing generation, the extraordinary wisdom that had once guided Atlantean rulers required more effort to access. Decisions that their god-born ancestors had made intuitively now demanded careful deliberation. Problems that divine insight had once resolved immediately began to require consultation with advisors, examination of precedent, and sometimes even compromise between competing interests. The kings remained wise, remained devoted to their people's welfare, but they had to work harder to achieve the same results that their forebears had accomplished effortlessly. And human nature, patient and persistent, as the tide itself began to seep through the cracks that were forming in their divine armour. It began with small indulgences that seemed harmless enough. A king might commission a palace slightly larger than was strictly necessary for conducting state business. Another might develop a taste for exotic foods that required extensive trade expeditions to obtain. A third might begin to enjoy the deference shown to him by foreign ambassadors. Just a little too much, taking pleasure not merely in representing his people with dignity, but in demonstrating his superiority over lesser rulers. These were not yet corruptions in any meaningful sense. They were simply the natural expressions of human appetites that had been held in perfect check by divine wisdom for countless generations. But as that wisdom grew fainter, as the god blood thinned with each new birth, The restraints that had once made such appetites irrelevant began to weaken as well. The citizens of Atlantis began to notice changes in their rulers, though they found it difficult to articulate exactly what was different. Their kings remained wise, remained far superior to any monarchs who ruled in foreign lands. The ceremonies continued to be performed with proper reverence. The laws remained fair and were still enforced with appropriate mercy. The empire continued to prosper. Its ships still dominated the ocean trade routes. Its cities still gleamed like jewels in the morning sun. And yet something in the very atmosphere of their civilization was beginning to feel different. Where once the royal presence had inspired a kind of awe that mixed love with reverence in perfect proportion, now there seemed to be slightly more emphasis on the reverence and slightly less on the love. Where once citizens had approached their rulers with the confidence of children seeking guidance from beloved parents, now there was a subtle formality creeping into these interactions, a sense that proper protocol was becoming more important than genuine connection. The perfect mirror was developing its first visible cracks, hairline fractures that distorted the reflection just enough to be noticeable to those who knew what to look for. But the most troubling change was not in how the Atlanteans related to their kings, but in how the kings had begun to relate to each other. For generations beyond counting, the 10 rulers of the empire had gathered for their sacred ceremonies with hearts full of genuine brotherhood, united not only by their divine ancestry, but by their shared commitment to justice and the welfare of their people. Now subtle competitions began to emerge between them. Nothing dramatic, nothing that violated their ancient oaths or threatened the peace of the empire. But perhaps one king would arrive at the sacred gathering with a slightly larger retinue than was customary, or wearing ceremonial robes that displayed his wealth a bit too prominently. Another might speak during their deliberations with just a touch more emphasis on his own kingdom's achievements than on their shared accomplishments. The seeds of pride were being planted in soil that had been fertilized by the gradual weakening of divine restraint. And pride once planted grows with frightening speed. As the divine blood continued to thin through successive generations, what had begun as barely perceptible shifts in character began to manifest themselves in ways that could no longer be ignored, and the perfect civilization that Poseidon had designed as a testament to the harmony between divine and human nature started to reshape itself according to very different principles. The changes became visible first in the great construction projects that had always been the pride of Atlantean civilization. Where once the kings had built temples that soared toward the heavens as offerings to the gods, now they began to commission monuments that seemed designed more to glorify their own reigns than to honor the divine powers that had blessed their island. The architecture remained magnificent, perhaps even more technically impressive than what had come before, but something essential had changed in its purpose and spirit. These new buildings spoke not of humility and reverence, but of a growing hunger for recognition that their ancestors would have found deeply troubling. A king who ruled the northern territories ordered the construction of a palace whose golden dome was designed to be visible from distances that had previously seemed impossible. Another monarch commissioned a harbour entrance, marked by statues of himself that stood so tall they dwarfed the ships passing between them. The ruler of the eastern provinces created gardens filled with plants and animals gathered from the furthest corners of the known world, not because these exotic species served any practical purpose, but simply because their rarity demonstrated the vast reach of his power and wealth. The citizens of Atlantis watched these developments with growing unease, though they found it difficult to articulate their concerns. Their rulers remained wise in their judgments and just in their enforcement of the law. The empire continued to prosper. Trade flowed smoothly along sea routes that stretched to every corner of the civilized world. The sacred ceremonies continued to be observed with proper reverence and traditional protocol. And yet, something fundamental was changing in the very soul of their civilization. The shift was perhaps most apparent in how the Atlanteans began to relate to the foreign peoples whose lands bordered their maritime empire. For generations, Atlantean merchants and diplomats had been welcomed in distant ports not merely because of their wealth and power, but because they brought with them a reputation for fairness and honour that made them trusted partners in trade and valued allies in times of difficulty. Atlantean law had been adopted by dozens of smaller civilizations not through conquest or coercion, but because its wisdom and justice offered solutions to problems that local customs could not address. Now, however, there was a subtle but unmistakable change in these relationships. Atlantean ambassadors began to speak with voices that carried less humility and more demand. Their proposals for trade agreements showed increasing concern for extracting maximum advantage rather than creating mutually beneficial partnerships. When disputes arose with foreign nations, the Atlantean response demonstrated less patience for negotiation and more reliance on the implied threat of their overwhelming military superiority. The reaction from their neighbours was predictable and deeply troubling. Where once foreign dignitaries had sought audiences with Atlantean rulers as opportunities to learn from the wisest governors in the ancient world, now these meetings began to feel more like vassals reporting to an imperial court. Where once smaller nations had voluntarily adopted Atlantean customs because they admired their elegance and effectiveness, now such adoption began to feel more like submission to inevitable pressure. The perfect mirror was reflecting an image that grew darker with each passing season. Within Atlantis itself, the changes were creating subtle but persistent tensions that had been unknown during the golden age of divine rule. Citizens who had once approached their kings with confident trust now found themselves calculating the proper degree of deference required for different occasions. Merchants discovered that access to the most lucrative trade opportunities increasingly depended not merely on the quality of their goods or the fairness of their prices, but on their ability to demonstrate appropriate respect for royal sensibilities. The arts, which had once celebrated the harmony between human achievement and divine blessing, began to shift their focus toward themes that glorified earthly power and material prosperity. Sculptors created works that emphasized the magnificence of royal regalia rather than the wisdom of royal decisions. Poets composed verses that catalogued the vast territories and countless treasures under Atlantean control rather than exploring the philosophical principles that made such control beneficial to all concerned. Even the sacred rituals that bound the empire together began to change in ways that were disturbing to those who remembered how they had been performed in earlier times. The ceremonies remained technically correct in every detail, but they seemed to be conducted with more attention to their political significance than to their spiritual meaning. The gathering of the 10 kings became less about renewal of divine covenant and more about demonstration of continued unity in the face of growing ambition. The bulls were still hunted with traditional reverence. Their blood still flowed across the sacred pillar of orichalcum. The ancient oaths were still spoken with proper solemnity. But observers with sensitive hearts could detect a subtle falseness in these proceedings, as if the participants were performing roles in a drama whose deeper meaning they no longer fully understood. Something was dying at the heart of the perfect civilization. Something was dying slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it was dying nonetheless. And in the most sacred chambers of their temples, where the oldest priests maintained the rituals that connected Atlantis to its divine origins, whispers began to spread about strange omens and troubling signs that suggested the gods themselves were beginning to withdraw their favour from the children of their children's children. The perfect mirror was cracking from edge to centre, and through those cracks something dark was beginning to seep. From his throne, at the centre of all creation, where the light of every star converged and the songs of every world harmonised into a single, eternal melody. Zeus, the cloud gatherer, the father of gods and men, the supreme ruler whose will shaped the very foundations of reality, turned his immortal gaze toward the distant island, where his brother's greatest experiment in divine human cooperation was approaching its final tragic conclusion. The sight that met his eyes would have moved even the hardest heart to sorrow. Where once the king of gods had observed a civilization that served as a beacon of hope for all creation, a living proof that mortals could indeed be trusted with divine gifts and guided toward wisdom that rivaled the gods themselves. Now he saw something that filled even his immortal heart with profound disappointment. The Atlanteans had not become the monsters that plagued other corners of the earth. They had not descended into the crude barbarism that characterized so many human societies. Their transformation was far more subtle and therefore far more heartbreaking. They had simply become magnificently, ruthlessly, brilliantly human. The divine spark that had once elevated their every thought and action above the common concerns of mortality had not been extinguished so much as buried beneath layers of ambition, pride, and appetite that grew thicker with each passing generation. The wisdom remained, but it was now wisdom employed in service of increasingly selfish ends. The justice endured, but it was justice that somehow always seemed to favour Atlantean interests over those of their neighbours. The power persisted and even grew, but it was power that delighted in its own exercise, rather than focusing solely on the welfare of those it was meant to serve. Zeus watched as Atlantean fleets, once welcomed in every port as harbingers of fair trade and cultural exchange, now approached foreign shores like wolves circling a flock. The ships were still beautiful, beyond description, their hulls carved from the finest woods and sheathed in metals that gleamed like captured starlight. Their sails still bore the sacred symbols that connected them to divine authority. Their crews still possessed skills that surpassed anything known to other maritime peoples. But the purposes for which this magnificence was employed had changed in ways that would have horrified their god-born ancestors. Where once Atlantean merchants had offered goods that enriched the lives of foreign peoples while creating lasting bonds of friendship and mutual respect, now they extracted wealth through arrangements that left their trading partners increasingly dependent and impoverished. The terms were always technically fair, the contracts always legally binding, the procedures always conducted with perfect courtesy and respect. But the underlying spirit had shifted from partnership toward domination, from mutual benefit toward systematic exploitation. The transformation was visible in every aspect of Atlantean society, and Zeus observed it all with the patience of eternity and the growing sadness of a father watching beloved children destroy themselves through choices they could not recognize as destructive. In the great councils where the 10 kings continued to gather for their sacred ceremonies, the rituals proceeded with flawless precision, but the hearts that participated in them had grown cold with calculation rather than warm with brotherhood. Each king now came to these gatherings not seeking wisdom for the benefit of all, but looking for advantages that might elevate his own kingdom above the others. The ancient oaths were still spoken with reverence, but they were interpreted with increasing creativity to allow for actions that would have been unthinkable in earlier generations. The blood of the sacred bull still flowed across the pillar of orichalcum, but it seemed to Zeus that the metal itself had begun to dim, as if the divine essence within it was slowly withdrawing in response to the corruption it was forced to witness. The corruption was not crude or obvious. These were not kings who openly violated their sacred trusts or abandoned the forms of justice and proper governance. They remained more civilized, more cultured, more technically competent than any rulers who had ever existed in other parts of the world, but they had lost something far more precious than technical skill or even basic morality. They had lost the ability to see beyond themselves. Where their ancestors had viewed their power as a sacred trust held on behalf of all creation, the current generation of Atlantean rulers saw it as a tool for advancing their own glory and that of their immediate kingdoms. Where earlier, kings had made decisions by asking what would best serve the eternal principles of justice and harmony. Their descendants asked what would most effectively demonstrate their superiority over potential rivals. The perfect mirror had become a funhouse reflection, distorting everything it showed until truth became unrecognizable. Zeus understood that this transformation was not the result of any external evil or supernatural corruption. It was simply the inevitable consequence of mixing divine nature with human flesh across enough generations to allow mortality to gradually overwhelm immortality. His brother Poseidon had meant well in creating this hybrid civilization, but he had not fully anticipated how difficult it would be to maintain divine wisdom within vessels that became more human with each passing century. The experiment was failing, and Zeus, who ruled according to law and justice rather than sentiment or favoritism, knew that such failure could not be allowed to continue indefinitely. The Atlanteans were becoming too powerful, too influential, too capable of spreading their corrupted version of divine authority throughout the ancient world. If they were permitted to continue on their current path, their example would poison every attempt to elevate humanity toward its higher potential. The King of Gods began to gather the divine council for a consultation that would determine the fate of the most magnificent civilization the mortal world had ever produced. In the divine council chamber, where the fates of worlds were decided, Zeus spoke with the voice of law itself, and his words carried the weight of cosmic justice that no appeal could overturn, no mercy could soften, no power could resist. The assembled gods listened in silence as their king pronounced judgment on the civilization that had once been their greatest hope and had now become their deepest disappointment. There would be no gradual decline, no slow fading into obscurity, no gentle dissolution that might allow the corrupted wisdom of Atlantis to spread its poison throughout the ancient world. The end, when it came, would be swift and absolute, so complete that future generations would struggle to believe that such a place had ever existed at all. But even divine justice, for all its terrible swiftness, carried within it a kind of mercy. For the Atlanteans would not be given time to recognize their doom, approaching no opportunity to contemplate the magnitude of their fall or to experience the slow agony of watching everything they had built crumble around them. Their end would come like sleep to the exhausted, sudden and complete, transforming their magnificent empire into legend in the space of a single day and night. The morning of that final day dawned no differently from thousands that had come before it. In the harbour rings of the great capital, ships arrived from distant ports, carrying the wealth of continents in their holds. Merchants haggled over prices with the same intensity they had shown for generations. Children played in gardens where flowers bloomed with the abundance that divine blessing had made eternal. Craftsmen worked precious metals into forms of beauty that would have made foreign kings weep with envy. The great temple of Poseidon glowed with its accustomed magnificence, its silver walls catching and reflecting the morning sunlight as they had for countless centuries. No omens marked this day as different from any other. No prophets appeared in the marketplaces crying warnings of impending doom. The priests performed their morning rituals with the same reverence they had always shown. The sacred bulls grazed peacefully in temple grounds that had known nothing but tranquility since the time of their divine patron's first blessing. The Atlanteans went about their daily lives with the supreme confidence that comes from belonging to the most powerful, most advanced, most perfectly organized civilization the world has ever known. They had no idea they were living through their last hours. As the day progressed, the normal rhythms of Atlantean life continued without interruption. In the royal palaces, kings consulted with advisors about trade agreements that would never be completed. In the great workshops, artisans labored over masterpieces that would never be finished. In the academies, scholars debated questions of philosophy and science that would never be resolved. Lovers made promises they would never have the chance to keep. Parents tucked children into beds from which they would never wake. The sun set over Atlantis for the final time, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed more beautiful than ever before, as if the heavens themselves were offering a last perfect gift to the civilization that was about to vanish forever. And then in the depths of the night, when most of the island's inhabitants lay sleeping in dreams of tomorrow's possibilities, the earth itself began to shudder with the first whispers of divine wrath. It started so gently that even those who were awake barely noticed it, a tremor so slight it might have been caused by a passing ship or a heavy cart rolling through nearby streets. Then another slightly stronger, causing sleepers to shift in their beds without quite awakening. Then a third that was strong enough to rattle loose objects on shelves and cause a few citizens to step outside their homes to peer into the darkness with puzzled expressions. The sea began to withdraw from the harbours with a sound like the world's largest sigh. In the outer rings where the great ships rode at anchor, captains watched in growing alarm as water levels dropped with impossible speed, exposing harbour floors that had been hidden beneath the waves since the time of Poseidon's first reshaping of the land. The magnificent vessels that had carried Atlantean power to every corner of the known world found themselves resting on mud and sand, their hulls groaning as they settled onto surfaces never meant to bear their weight. Then the water returned. It came not as a normal tide returning to its accustomed level, but as a mountain of liquid power that rose from the depths of the ocean, like the vengeful spirit of the sea itself. Wave upon wave crashed over the outer walls of the great city, each one higher than the last, each one carrying enough force to shatter stone that had stood since the age of heroes. The perfect circles that Poseidon had carved with such loving precision began to collapse inward, as the very foundations of the island cracked and shifted beneath pressures that no earthly engineering could withstand. The rings of land that had provided such elegant structure to the greatest city ever built started to subside into the churning waters that filled the spaces between them, and still the waves kept coming. The perfect mirror was shattering into 1,000 pieces, each fragment reflecting chaos, where once there had been harmony, destruction, where once there had been creation ending, where once there had been eternal beginning. In the span of a single night, the most magnificent civilization in the history of the world simply ceased to exist. When dawn broke over waters that had never known such violence, there was nothing left but foam and debris floating on waves that would continue to churn with mud for centuries to come. The silence was absolute. And so we find ourselves, more than 2,000 years later, sitting in the silence that followed that terrible night, holding in our hands nothing but the words of a single philosopher, and the endless questions that those words have spawned across the centuries. Did Atlantis ever truly exist? This question has haunted scholars, explorers, and dreamers since the moment Plato first set his stylus to wax and began to tell the tale of the lost civilization that vanished beneath the waves. For every generation of readers has found themselves caught between two equally compelling possibilities, each one carrying profound implications for how we understand both the ancient world and our own. On one side stand those who read Plato's account and hear in it the unmistakable ring of historical truth. They point to the extraordinary detail with which the philosopher describes the geography of his lost island, the precision of his measurements, the specificity of his claims about dates and relationships between ancient civilizations. They argue that no writer, no matter how imaginative, could invent from whole cloth a narrative so rich in concrete details, so consistent in its internal logic, so compelling in its portrayal of a society that seems almost too perfect to be fiction. These believers search the oceans and the ancient texts for traces of the vanished empire. They study geological evidence for sudden catastrophes that might have claimed entire islands in a single night. They examine archaeological discoveries from civilizations that flourished during the time period when Atlantis supposedly existed, looking for influences that might have come from a maritime power of unprecedented sophistication. The evidence they have assembled is tantalizing, but never quite conclusive. ancient maps that seem to show land masses in the Atlantic where none exist today, archaeological sites that demonstrate engineering capabilities far more advanced than scholars once thought possible for Bronze Age civilizations, legends from cultures as distant as Ireland and India that speak of lost homelands claimed by sudden floods or earthquakes, geological formations that suggest massive upheavals in precisely the regions where Atlantis might once have stood. And yet for every piece of evidence that seems to support the historical existence of Atlantis, skeptical scholars can offer alternative explanations that are equally plausible and perhaps more likely. The detailed geography might simply reflect Plato's skill as a storyteller rather than his access to historical records. The precision of measurement might be the mark of a philosophical mind that understood the power of concrete details to make abstract ideas feel real and immediate. These skeptics point to the fact that no contemporary source mentions the Great War between Athens and Atlantis that supposedly shook the foundations of the ancient world. No Egyptian records from the period in question contain any reference to the catastrophic sinking of a massive island empire. No other Greek author before Plato shows any awareness of this extraordinary tale, despite its obvious relevance to questions of politics and justice that concerned many ancient writers. Most tellingly, they observe that the story of Atlantis appears in Plato's dialogues as part of a larger philosophical argument about the ideal state and the dangers of political corruption. The details of Atlantean society, with its perfect governance, gradually giving way to pride and ambition, mirror exactly the theoretical concerns that occupy much of Plato's political writing. The tale seems designed less to preserve historical memory than to illustrate eternal truths about power and human nature. But perhaps this debate over historical accuracy misses the deeper significance of what Plato accomplished when he created his account of the lost civilization. Whether Atlantis existed as a physical place or sprang fully formed from the philosopher's imagination, it has proven to be one of the most powerful and enduring creations of human consciousness. For over 2,300 years, the image of the perfect society that destroyed itself through its own success has served as a mirror in which successive generations could examine their own civilizations and their own hearts. The perfect mirror reflects whatever the viewer brings to it. Those who live in ages of expansion and conquest see in Atlantis a warning about the dangers of imperial overreach. Those who experience periods of moral decline recognize in the gradual corruption of the God-born kings a reflection of their own society's movement away from its founding ideals. Those who witness technological marvels that seem to surpass all previous human achievement find in Atlantean engineering a vision of what their own capabilities might become for better or for worse. And perhaps this adaptability, this capacity to speak across centuries to the deepest concerns of human civilization, is the most powerful evidence for the truth of Plato's creation. Not truth in the narrow sense of historical accuracy, but truth in the broader sense of insight into the permanent realities of human nature and social organization that transcend any particular time or place. For whether the Atlanteans ever walked upon real Earth or sailed across actual seas, their story continues to illuminate questions that every civilization must face. How do we maintain virtue in the midst of prosperity? How do we preserve justice when we possess overwhelming power? How do we resist the corruption that seems to follow inevitably from success? The perfect mirror waits to show us whatever reflection we are prepared to see. And so our journey ends where it began, with an old man in ancient Athens telling a story so extraordinary that it has outlived empires, survived the burning of libraries, and continued to speak across 23 centuries to anyone willing to listen to its whispers from the depths of time. We have walked through temples of ivory and gold, sailed past harbours carved from living rock, and witnessed the rise and fall of the most perfect civilization that human imagination has ever conceived. We have asked whether Atlantis was history or allegory, memory or dream, and we have found not one answer, but many, each reflection as true as the surface that reveals it. But Atlantis, whether it existed in stone and flesh or only in the realm of ideas, did not truly vanish when the waves closed over its magnificent towers and perfect circles of land and sea. Its legacy flows through our world like an underground river, surfacing in places and times we might never expect to find it. Every utopian vision that has ever captured human imagination owes something to Plato's account of the divine civilization that achieved perfection only to lose it through the very human failings of pride and ambition. Every cautionary tale about the dangers of power corrupting those who wield it echoes the story of the God-born kings, who gradually forgot the divine wisdom that had made their rule a blessing rather than a burden. The explorers who sailed west from European shores in search of new worlds carried maps marked with islands that might once have been called Atlantis. The architects who designed the great cities of our modern age drew inspiration, whether they knew it or not, from the concentric rings and perfect proportions that Poseidon carved from love and divine geometry. The scientists who peer into the deepest trenches of our oceans are still searching in their own way for evidence of the impossible civilization that vanished in a single day and night. And perhaps most importantly, every generation that has grappled with the eternal questions of how to build just societies and how to prevent the corruption of noble ideals has found in the story of Atlantis a mirror that reflects both their highest hopes and their deepest fears about what human civilization might become. The perfect mirror continues to show us whatever reflection we are prepared to see, and in that perpetual revelation lies both warning and promise, both comfort and challenge. Whether we choose to see Atlantis as a lost golden age that we might somehow recover, or as a cautionary tale that reminds us of the vigilance required to maintain the virtues upon which all lasting civilization must rest, or simply as the most beautiful dream ever committed to written words, the choice itself reveals as much about us as it does about the mysterious island that may or may not have disappeared beneath the waves of the Western Ocean in the distant mists of prehistory. Tonight, as you settle into sleep and allow your consciousness to drift toward the peaceful realm of dreams, you might find yourself standing on a shore where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, gazing westward across waters that stretch toward horizons no ancient mariner ever mapped. In the distance, perhaps you might glimpse the faint outline of an island where temples still gleamed with captured starlight, where gardens bloom with flowers from every corner of the world, where the sound of fountains mingles with gentle laughter, echoing from marble courtyards that time has forgotten. Or perhaps you will see nothing but endless waters reflecting a sky full of stars, each point of light carrying its own story of worlds that might have been civilizations that rose and fell in cycles as natural as the turning of the seasons, dreams that achieved perfect form only to dissolve back into the eternal ocean of possibility from which all dreams emerge and to which all dreams eventually return. The waves that claimed Atlantis still whisper along shores throughout our world, carrying with them the salt of ancient tears and the memory of laughter that once rang through halls no earthly architect has ever duplicated. Listen carefully as you drift towards sleep, and you might hear in their eternal rhythm the echo of voices speaking in languages that have been forgotten for millennia, telling stories of a time when gods walked among mortals and love could reshape continents with the gentle precision of a divine hand guiding mortal clay toward forms of beauty that no purely human imagination could conceive. The perfect mirror lies still and clear beneath waters that reflect not what was or what might have been, but what always is in the realm, where stories become more real than the reality they describe, where truth wears the gentle mask of myth, and where the impossible island of our deepest longings waits eternally just beyond the edge of waking vision. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the past. I hope the story of Atlantis has brought the beauty and mystery of the ancient world to life. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.